Trump's strategy shift. A new era of global confrontation. The first indication that the rules of global engagement had fundamentally changed came not from a formal address to the nation, nor from a policy paper circulated in the corridors of Brussels. It came instead from a single, terse social media post aimed at a tiny archipelago in the Indian Ocean, a place most Americans would struggle to find on a map. When President Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on the Maldives for what he termed anti-American rhetoric, the world didn't laugh. It listened. It was a shot fired across the bow of every nation, large and small, signaling that in this new era, no one was too insignificant to be left alone, and no ally was too old to be spared the lash. For those of us who have spent decades covering the slow, grinding machinery of international diplomacy, the shift has been breathtaking in its speed. We have moved from an era of multilateral consensus building, where the United States acted as the guarantor of a global system, to an era of bilateral coercion, where the United States acts as the primary disruptor. It is a strategic pivot that scholars will debate for generations, but for the citizens of the world living through it, the effects are immediate and visceral. From the factory floors of Germany to the rice paddies of Vietnam, the question is no longer what Washington is building, but what and who it is willing to break. To understand the genesis of this doctrine, one must look back to the closing days of the first Trump administration. The conventional wisdom at the time was that the chaos was temporary, a 4-year aberration that would be corrected by the return to normalcy under President Biden. But beneath the surface of that supposed normalcy, the tectonic plates were shifting. The withdrawal from Afghanistan, executed by Biden but conceptualized by Trump, shattered the myth of American omnipotence. It told the world that the US had limits, that it would not bleed indefinitely for abstract principles. The current strategy is built on the rubble of that withdrawal. The intellectual architects of this new approach are a cadre of realist thinkers and America First economists who have long argued that the post-1945 order was a generous subsidy paid for by the American taxpayer with little return. They view institutions like NATO, the World Trade Organization, and the United Nations not as force multipliers, but as constraints on American sovereignty. In their reading of history, the unipolar moment is over, and the only way to navigate a multipolar world is to reassert dominance through raw economic power, regardless of the diplomatic wreckage left in the wake. This philosophy was on full display during the recent Munich Security Conference, a gathering traditionally defined by flowery speeches about transatlantic unity. This year, the American delegation, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, delivered a blistering critique of European allies, accusing them of free-riding on defense and pursuing regulatory policies that hurt US tech giants. The room, according to multiple sources, was stunned into silence. The message was clear. The security umbrella that had protected Europe for 80 years was now up for renegotiation, and the price had just gone up. The weapon of choice in this new era of confrontation is the tariff, a blunt instrument that the administration wields with increasing precision. But it is no longer just about balancing trade deficits. Tariffs are now being deployed to achieve geopolitical objectives. When President Trump recently threatened sanctions on Colombia over a dispute regarding the acceptance of deportation flights, it was not about migration policy alone. It was a demonstration effect, a piece of theater designed to show every nation in Latin America that defiance of Washington would carry a swift and painful price, regardless of historical partnership. Perhaps the most alarming development for traditional allies has been the administration's overtures to adversaries. The back-channel communications with Moscow regarding Ukraine, conducted without European input, have sent shivers through NATO headquarters. The willingness to engage in high-level talks with the Taliban, granting them legitimacy they have sought for 2 decades, signals a pragmatic, transactional approach to foreign policy, where ideology and human rights are discarded as luxuries the US can no longer afford. It is realpolitik executed at digital speed, leaving allies scrambling to catch up. In the Middle East, the strategy has been equally disorienting. While the administration publicly champions the Abraham Accords and seeks a grand normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, its private warnings to Gulf states have been stark. According to diplomatic cables obtained by Reuters, the US has informed its Gulf partners that the days of guaranteed American military protection are ending, urging them to formalize defense pacts quickly, or face the consequences of a regional arms race without a backstop. This has forced Riyadh and Abu Dhabi to hedge their bets, deepening ties with China and Russia, even as they negotiate with Washington. The economic implications of this strategic shift are only beginning to be understood. Global supply chains, already fragile after the pandemic, are being rewired not for efficiency, but for geopolitical safety. The de-risking from China that the Biden administration encouraged has become a decoupling forced by Trumpian ultimatums. Companies are being told to choose the American market or the Chinese market. This binary choice is tearing apart corporate boardrooms and forcing nations like Germany, with its deep industrial ties to Beijing, into an impossible diplomatic contortion act. Inside the White House, the process is less a structured policy review and more a reflection of the president's instincts. Multiple insiders describe a decision-making environment where the National Security Council is often bypassed in favor of a small coterie of family members and longtime confidants. A chance remark by the president about a country he saw on television can morph into a full-blown diplomatic crisis within hours. The professional foreign service, trained to manage relationships over decades, has been relegated to a cleanup crew, tasked with soothing egos after the latest conflagration. The impact on the so-called rules-based order has been catastrophic. In Geneva, diplomats from the World Trade Organization watch helplessly as the appellate body remains defunct, with the US blocking any effort to revive it. The message is that the dispute resolution mechanism, once the crown jewel of global trade, is dead. In this new world, might makes right. Nations with smaller economies are discovering that their legal rights under treaties mean nothing if they lack the military or economic power to enforce them, against a superpower that has renounced the very idea of international law. For Europe, the crisis has sparked a belated and painful awakening. For decades, the continent relied on the American security guarantee while building a welfare state. Now leaders in Berlin and Paris are frantically discussing the unthinkable, a European nuclear deterrent independent of NATO. The rhetoric coming from Washington has convinced even the most Atlanticist of European leaders that they can no longer assume American boots on the ground in the event of a Russian incursion into the Baltics. The alliance built on trust is now built on fear. In Asia, the calculus is even more complex. Nations like Japan and South Korea, historically reliant on the US Navy, are watching the developments with alarm. They see the tough talk on China, but they also see the transactional nature of the administration. There is a growing fear that a grand bargain could be struck between Washington and Beijing over their heads, trading away their interests for a temporary truce. This has accelerated discussions in Tokyo about constitutional reform and in Seoul about the potential development of indigenous nuclear capabilities. The developing world, meanwhile, is being forced to navigate a landscape it did not create. The non-aligned movement, a relic of the Cold War, has found new relevance as nations in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia refuse to pick a side. They are exploiting the rivalry, accepting investment from China, while seeking aid from the West, playing the superpowers against each other. This multipolar fluidity gives them leverage they have never had before, but it also makes them vulnerable. A superpower that feels betrayed is a superpower that retaliates. Back in Washington, the domestic political calculus is clear. The strategy of confrontation is popular with a base that feels the country has been taken advantage of for too long. The narrative of a strongman standing up to the world resonates in rural and industrial heartlands. The fact that tariffs function as a regressive tax, disproportionately hurting lower-income Americans who pay more for imported goods, is a nuance lost in the rhetoric of economic nationalism. For now, the political benefits of looking tough abroad outweigh the economic costs at home. But the international system is not passive, it is pushing back. The formation of a BRICS plus trading bloc, designed to challenge the hegemony of the dollar, has accelerated. Nations are settling oil contracts in yuan and rupees, chipping away at the very foundation of American financial power. The weaponization of the dollar, through sanctions and tariffs, has paradoxically encouraged the world to find alternatives. If the dollar is a weapon, adversaries reason, why keep your savings in the enemy's currency? It is a slow bleed, but a potentially fatal one. The human cost of this grand strategy is often invisible in the policy debates. In Vietnam, A factory worker making sneakers for an American brand loses her job when the tariffs make the shoes too expensive. In Iowa, a soybean farmer watches his crop rot in the silo as the Chinese market dries up. In Germany, an auto worker faces an uncertain future as his company shifts production to Alabama to avoid trade barriers. These are the faces of geopolitical realignment, faces that never appear in the Situation Room, but bear the heaviest burden of the decisions made there. As we look toward the horizon, the potential flashpoints are multiplying. The South China Sea, where the US Navy continues freedom of navigation operations, is a tinderbox. Taiwan, which the administration has simultaneously promised to defend and hinted it could trade, remains the most dangerous spot on the planet. A miscalculation there, a misinterpretation of intent, could spiral into a conflict that dwarfs anything we have seen this century. The lack of clear, consistent communication between great powers makes this the most perilous moment since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The situation in Eastern Europe is equally volatile. With US support for Ukraine now contingent on Kiev securing European reese deposits for American companies, the nature of the conflict has shifted. It is no longer a crusade for democracy against autocracy. It is a resource war. This reframing has demoralized Ukrainian troops and given Russian propagandists a powerful narrative. If the war is just about minerals, they argue, why should Ukrainians die? It is a cynical but effective line of attack that undermines the very moral foundation of the resistance. In the intelligence community, there is a growing sense of unease. Sources within the CIA and MI6 describe a situation where human sources in hostile nations are becoming harder to recruit. The message from potential defectors is clear. If the US abandons the Kurds, if it leaves the Afghans to the Taliban, why would anyone trust that Washington would protect an asset? The currency of intelligence is trust, and that currency is being rapidly devalued by the transactional nature of the new foreign policy. The consequences of this intelligence gap may not be felt for a decade, but they will be severe. The environmental dimension of this confrontation is rarely discussed but critically important. As the US and China engage in a trade war, cooperation on climate change has ground to a halt. The Paris Agreement, already weakened by the first Trump withdrawal, is now an afterthought. The result is a governance vacuum on the one issue that threatens the entire planet. While superpowers bicker over tariffs and territory, the polar ice caps melt and the temperatures rise. It is the ultimate example of the tragedy of the commons playing out on a global scale. The final piece of this puzzle is the erosion of soft power. For decades, American universities, Hollywood films, and technology platforms were the envy of the world, drawing the brightest minds to American shores. That allure is fading. International student applications are plummeting, as young people from India and China question whether the US is a welcoming place. The perception of America as a land of opportunity is being replaced by a perception of America as a land of chaos and confrontation. That reputational damage will take a generation to repair, if it can be repaired at all. As we sit here in the early months of 2026, the world holds its breath. The old order is dead, its funeral attended by the very nation that gave it birth. What rises in its place is unclear. It could be a new bipolarity, with the US and China staring each other down across a divided globe. It could be a return to the chaos of the 19th century, where great powers carved up spheres of influence with little regard for the people living within them. Or it could be something new, a multipolar mosaic where middle powers like India, Brazil, and Indonesia carve out their own space, rejecting the dominance of any single hegemon. The tragedy of this moment is that it was not inevitable. The alliance systems, the trade pacts, the international institutions, they were not perfect, but they kept the peace. They prevented the very kind of great power rivalry that is now simmering just below the surface. They were built by a generation that had witnessed the horrors of World War and vowed never to repeat them. That generation is gone, and with them perhaps the wisdom that conflict, once ignited, is impossible to control. The architects of the new confrontation seem to believe they can manage the fire. History suggests otherwise.